For the event to commence in about less than 5 minutes, I just want to put some context to. I am indeed delighted that we are able to actually put this webinar together with the active support of Neyveli Lignite Corporation, then Knowledge Partners, Grant Thornton, and our academic partner, Alliance University. As this is the first time that IOD is actually conducting a webinar focused on ESG. As you all know, it's an evaluation of a company's collective consciousness of social and environmental factors. We all know a whole lot about governance, but we call this as the new frontier because governance is going to have very strong interface with environment and social. In fact, social also, some people do believe that governance had an interface with the CSR activities of various companies because it cared for the community around which the facility actually is put up and the company actually works. But the kind of a trident approach, that is environment, social, and governance, as not only a matter of governance, but also a basis on which responsible investing can happen. So there is a paradigm shift in the way investors are going to look at companies and kind of benchmark those companies with the global players in the same field to see how you're faring and whether they are putting their money in the right place and whether it is actually going to benefit the community at large and promote environment and contribute to the ecosystem. Because somewhere along the line, over a period of few years, has percolated to India now, but over a period of years, ESG has been gaining attention to various companies in various countries. And investors are increasingly believing that their money should go to a place which actually helps the company to promote environment and social and governance all put together as a one bouquet of governance. So it's very, very interesting, and ESG is going to be a very interesting concept, and Indian corporates will come under scrutiny, not by the top line and the bottom line, but also from the kind of effort they make to benchmark themselves to various global players in terms of ESG compliance. So we will hear more from the people about ESG scorecard and various other benchmarking abilities, besides a fund of knowledge that will come through various speakers that we are going to have today. We are indeed privileged to have a good array of speakers, and we are going to start without much ado. It is just about half a minute or so. Let me take the opportunity of introducing to you our Bangalore chapter chairman, who is the driving force, if I may use the expression. I don't want to embarrass him, but he is a driving force for IOD Bangalore chapter, and he spearheads the initiatives. Mr. Arun Balakrishnan is the founder chairman of HPCL Mittal Energy Limited and is currently a member of the board. He was the CMD of Hindustan Petroleum Corporation. Currently, Mr. Balakrishnan is on the board of a number of companies as independent director, besides being a member of the board of governors, University of Petroleum and Energy Studies, Dehradun. He is also the immediate past president of Indian Institution of Industrial Engineering. He is a chemical engineer with a postgraduate diploma from the Indian Institute of Management Bangalore. He is a recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award in 2008 from his alma mater. In the recent past, the All India Management Association has conferred a fellowship, and the Institute of Engineers has presented a scroll of honor for recognition of his outstanding contribution to the profession of chemical engineering. So I would very much request Arun Balakrishnan deliver the welcome address and set the tone for this webinar. Over to you, Arun.
Thank you, Prasanna, for the wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar on ESG to members of the Institute of Directors, the invitees of Grant Thornton Bharat, and all the other invitees who have logged in to be with us this afternoon. We have great speakers to take you through the next 2 hours, enlightening us on the new corporate metric, ESG. We are delighted that we have Mr. Nadir Godrej, Chairman and Managing Director of Godrej Industries, as a keynote speaker. Mr. Godrej is passionate about ESG in keeping with the philosophy of the Godrej family to do good to the nation. One of our invitees to the program told me that Mr. Godrej is as great a poet as he is an industrialist. So welcome to you, Mr. Godrej. Next, we have a special address by none other than Mr. Swarup Mohanty, CEO of Mirai Asset Investment Managers India. Mirai is one of the top investment managers in the country, and most of you here today would have benefited with investments in Mirai products. Mr. Mohanty can enlighten us on the importance for companies to adopt ESG as an operating principle and the impact it has on the valuation of companies, especially in a world impacted by climate change and millions of people with loss of life, property, and income. This will be followed by a panel discussion by experts from ESG, for whom ESG is an everyday affair. Mr. Dinesh Anand, National Managing Partner Risk from Grant Thornton, will be the moderator. And their distinguished panelists are Sresha George, Managing Director and Partner of Boston Consulting Group, Akhil Mehrotra, Managing Director of Pipeline Infrastructure Limited, a Brookfield company, Ulysses Smith, ESG Senior Advisor from Deadvoice and Plimpton, an international law firm, and Richa Arora, Managing Partner and CEO, ESG Stewardship Services. My colleague Prasanna will, a bit later, follow up with a more detailed introduction of the panel speakers. ESG, as you all know, stands for environmental, social, and governance. In a way, all three of them go together. In a nutshell, to put it very simply, ESG is a measure of how well you take care of Mother Earth. Be helpful, fair, and equitable to the people and the flora and fauna on it, and how you conduct your business, whatever it may be, honestly and within the boundaries of law. I do agree these are grand statements. The question is, how do we measure them equitably and fairly? As the old saying goes, what is measured is what gets done. The methodology of assigning ESG scores to corporates is taking good shape. And as Mr. Mohanty, I'm sure, may tell you, investor money can stay away from companies with low ESG scores. Renewable electricity, green hydrogen, and low carbon production has become part of everyone's vocabulary as zero carbon becomes the end game for mankind. That is why measuring carbon and standardizing how we do it is the key. It can change the entire financial system as the world reboots to address the likely disasters resulting from climate change. This is the only way we can meet the 2050 and 2070 targets the world and the country have set for ourselves. ESG, like any metric, is not without its own set of controversies. Some say ESG is yet another of those Western imports and a passing fad. Others say it is a human rights issue and an effective system should be put in place. People keen to leave a better world for our children are on a crusade. Since capital is the main ingredient for companies, some believe they could prevent funding to what they consider undesirable businesses. Norway's sovereign fund was applauded when it decided to dump fossil fuel-related investments, though its trillion-dollar wealth was built on selling fossil fuel to the world. Such activism, as per newspaper reports, has seen a 40% reduction in capital investment in exploration and production of oil since 2015 by multinational oil companies. This would entail lower production and hence higher price for fossil fuels in the months and years to come. Maybe this can push more people to opt for electric cars in the short run and maybe hydrogen cars in the slightly longer run. Nations and corporates have over the years addressed the concerns regarding governance to a great extent. However, this can be a never-ending pursuit, judging from what one reads in the daily news. As regards social, companies are engaging in refreshing CSR interventions, which includes education, hygiene, housing, and hosts of other areas. The options are many, and so are the challenges. Our distinguished speakers and panelists, I am sure, will address many of these concerns. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome once again. My colleague Prasanna Mysore will take the program forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arun. Thank you very much indeed for those opening remarks and setting the tone for our webinar. And I'm indeed very, very grateful to you. We have the honor and distinction, privilege of having Mr. Nadir B. Godrej as our keynote speaker. I quite realize that he is a very busy person. And in fact, when I approached his office, I was extremely delighted when I was told that this is a subject which is very close to his heart. And he would certainly like to take this opportunity of sharing his thoughts on ESG with a large group such as this, which has got immense response. And that indicates the importance that ESG has in everybody's mind. Mr. Nadir B. Godrej is the chairman and managing director of Godrej Industries Limited. Mr. Godrej is also the chairman of Godrej Agrovet Limited. He holds a Master of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from Stanford University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He has been a director of several Godrej companies since 1977 and has developed the animal feed, agricultural inputs, and chemicals businesses of Godrej Industries and other associate companies. And he has been very active in research as well. Mr. Godrej's outside commitments include President of Alliance Française de Bombay and CII National Council member. He is also a member of the South Asia Research Center Advisory Board of Harvard Business School and is associated with MIT Alumni Association of India and Stanford University. Mr. Godrej is also a member on the Schulich India Advisory Council. Mr. Godrej has been awarded Chevalier de Richon d'Honneur and Lifetime Achievement Award from Globoil, Oil Technology Association of India, Chemexil, the All India Liquid Bulk Importers and Exporters Association, and also Chemtech CW Leadership and Excellence Award. He also received the Porter Prize 2013 for creating shared value awarded to Godrej Industries Limited. Mr. Godrej is deeply committed to the good and green strategies and achievement of set targets for the Godrej Group. He encourages and supports a shared vision value for all programs of good and green. Science, linguistic, swimming, and poetry are his passion. He is the author of Life and Other Poems and Nadir Godrej, the Poet, a collection of English and French poems. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hand together for Mr. Nadir Godrej, and I welcome Mr. Godrej to deliver his keynote address. Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome, Mr. Godrej. Thank you very much for taking the time out to be with us today. We are indeed honored and privileged. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And we request you to please kindly deliver your keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Shall I start?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. According to Steven Pinker, and supported by many a thinker, the world's becoming a better place, though at a slow but steady pace. And yet, there are problems for sure, and climate change is at the fore. Inequality is also dire, and maybe getting much higher. If progress on all these is slow, the consequences are grave, we know. Their abilities and constraints are such that governments can't do much. NGOs have few means, but ability, and businesses have means, but don't see these issues as part of their core. For profit is how they would score. But business slowly realize that profit is a short-term prize. After all, what do businesses gain if they die out and don't sustain? But how much can they afford to spend to ensure their existence doesn't end? The answer's not easy to find, but a thought still comes to my mind. If the efforts of all are combined, the synergies that we can find reduces costs and raises gain and obviates inevitable pain. There's a capitalistic strain that enthrones shareholder gain, and Milton Friedman could see that the simplistic philosophy could lead to great efficiency, but wherever there's externality, this capitalism, red in tooth and claw, can prove to be a dismal flaw. Correction can come from regulation or even from self-remediation. And Adam Smith himself foresaw that business could address this flaw. It should be clearly understood. One can do well by doing good. Doing it smarter, we do better. So why not be the trendsetter? In capitalism's early days, we see social responsibility in some degree to dissipate the urban gloom. Both Cadbury, Lord Leverhulme, then pioneered the company town. Some observers would surely frown at their extremely paternal attitude, but many might view it with gratitude. We should remember in that age, it compensated their lowly wage. It's time to get the Tata Group now very much into the loop. Because it seemed morally right, the Tata Group then set its sight at such a very lofty height for what trade unions had to fight in Europe for several years was gifted by these worthy seers from the goodness of their heart. Undoubtedly, this played a part in honing their great reputation and then contributing to the nation. And doing good is very sound. What goes around does come around. Doing it good isn't just a cost. The gain outweighs all that's lost. My grandfather probably saw these examples and found no flaw. He bought far away marshy land. His critics just couldn't understand. They concluded he had gone quite mad. But today we are glad, not sad. A township then slowly arose, and this is where our business grows. We provided every needed tool, housing, hospital, and school. My uncle, known as SPG, way back could clearly see the environment was under stress. Neglect, he knew, would be a mess. Our creekside land was reserved. The mangroves there, well preserved. And from my office, I gaze out there, a Mumbai view that's very rare. With greenery all the way until you sight New Bombay. And now and then with friends I float on a gently moving boat with big flamingos in full flight. To my mind, a splendid sight. In saving tigers, he played a role. The environment was a major role. The Tata Trusts, as we all know, get a very constant flow of dividends from shares they own. It may not be quite as well known. Our trusts also have a share, the proportion smaller, but it's there. And here I think we all ought to pay careful heed to Michael Porter. With shared value, there's no cost for doing good, as nothing's lost. All it takes is a thinking brain to remove a societal pain and combine it with a business gain to create a sustainable chain of endless mutual benefit. This concept is a tremendous hit. We thought that we should also try and see if we could apply this philosophy to our group. Our employees also joined the loop. In the year 2010, studies were commissioned, and then, with the help of DASRA and FSG, our new program, one could see, we aptly named it Good and Green. And what a journey it has been. And how do we define our role? What could be a proper goal? Now the UN has a lengthy list, so in recounting, some would be missed. So I will focus on just three that I think would be the key for all the others to fall in place and enable us to win the race. Good health through perfect sanitation, environment, and education. All of these can be seen in our program, Good and Green. It is no longer climate change within a tolerable range. A crisis is what it's about, with fires, floods, as well as drought. Every week, a constant blast, far worse than seen in the past. If we must, we will adapt. Prevention, though, would be more apt. There is a cost to adaptation, and it's rising fast in every nation, as well as for the world at large. This will be a heavy charge. In fact, we should all conclude prevention would be far more shrewd. It actually would cost much less and avoid a lot of stress. All industry should play a role in the carbon neutral goal. GHG emissions should be reduced. More green energy should be produced. And so without partiality, our goal for all is neutrality, whether water, carbon, or solid waste. And very soon we will make haste to make our net emissions zero. Will that make the group a hero? In 2010, the goal looked tall, but we took a reasoned call. Technology would save the day. So far, it has turned out that way. To achieve these goals, we will strive to do it all by 2025. As technology takes a leap, green energy gets very cheap. Keen observers quickly saw that solar also tracks Moore's law, whether groundnut shell or bagasse are India's full of biomass. At first, we thought we'd have to spend, but that's not true, for in the end, the more we thought and the more we slaved, we did invest, but we also saved. And solar is still getting cheaper. And as we start digging deeper, in India, it will hit the goal of being cheaper than even coal in just a handful of years. Already, we and our peers are sourcing solar electricity at lower rates than from the utility. For quite some time, we've been exported as their finances aren't still sorted. A silver lining can be seen since it incentivizes green. Offsets help elimination, and rural electrification with distributed solar power is now the need of the hour. Our cost of water is not so high, but yet we do attempt to try to reduce our water consumption. But all the same, it's a safe assumption our water use won't disappear. And so to be neutral, I fear we will have to mitigate. Though fortunately, I can state that developing a watershed doesn't cost much, and instead, our agribusiness can benefit. The government will do its bit, but where it fails, we will fill the breach, and hopefully we will reach many farmers on the cheap. But the benefits that we reap will compensate for the cost, and once again, nothing is lost. There are many paths that we can see for achieving carbon neutrality, but the cheapest way is certainly through energy efficiency. Real interest rates are rather low, and high returns quickly flow for any energy-saving device. For business, this is very nice. Not only are returns quite brisk, there's also very little risk. In India, mandated CSR can help us go very far. Multiple benefits is what one sees. With water projects or growing trees, good livelihoods are created. Our carbon emissions are abated. Trees planted at a river source maintain the flow throughout its course. So many benefits we can see. The preservation of biodiversity, different species can be tried, useful products can be supplied, like biomass or edible fruits, and yet the trunk and the roots can sequester carbon, clean the air, a win-win that is very fair. So while we decarbonize, why not also monetize? So never fall for either or. Our hearts and minds demand much more. Neutrality can come with ease. Some may think that I'm a tease. Some companies are not yet sold. For some it's tough, or so I'm told. Energy-intensive firms would say it's tougher then for them to play. If you can turn all waste to gold, and if you can be very bold with inventing technology, any industry can see eventual neutrality. And there is so much more to gain if it's across our entire chain. The case, of course, is very clear, and yet we are nowhere near any kind of firm solution to end greenhouse gas pollution. Around the world, we would find so many leaders that are blind, or perhaps not so benighted, but conveniently short-sighted. Why undergo any pain if by the time you get the gain, you will no longer be around? To politicos, this may seem sound. Prevention is much better than cure. So learn it now or then endure the endless pain and aggravation of the heavy cost of adaptation. If you neutralize at a cost, competitively, much is lost. A uniform carbon tax would protect all our banks. But bear in mind, it's not a cost. For the economy, nothing's lost. A UBI could be instated. Some other tax could be rebated. And if this is indeed just so, each economy would still grow. Now, with the right advocacy, someday soon we could see an enabling global policy that would encourage us to be quite carbon neutral with no pain. The world can only stand to gain. We can be fair to every nation, avoid the cost of adaptation. But if we don't collaborate, we can't escape this sorry state. Now, COVID opened up our eyes. Let's hope that we've become quite wise. We saw the benefits of green, but something else was also seen. The different outcomes we could see because of inequality. Can COVID then act as a spur? Now, couldn't it help to stir our hearts and minds to newer heights with ESG now in our sights? The vision that we should now share is a brave new world, both green and fair. The environment isn't all. On society, let's take a call. Throughout the chain, let's keep in sight every person's human right. It's business as usual, not bravery, to end child labor and slavery. And in all businesses, we should see the broadest reach of diversity. Not only is it fair and right, it would give us the best insight. Since life is full of many hard knocks, we need to think out of the box. Diversity is the perfect age when we are required to wade through troubled waters or quagmires. Unusual thought is what inspires. Lack of health and education leads to the perpetuation of inequality through generations in almost all of our nations. Without good health, you never learn. If you don't learn, you can't earn. For health, as well as climate change, it certainly isn't strange that prevention's better than a cure. On public health, we should spend. It is much cheaper in the end. With little cost and greatest ease, we could reduce lifestyle disease. At any rate, I am quite sure we would spend less than for a cure. In order to achieve this goal, businesses could play a role through business models and CSR. Together, we can go quite far. And similarly, through education, we can serve ourselves and the nation. We often think that charity can address disparity, but tackling health and education are better means for alleviation. Through action and advocacy, we can help all humanity to create a world that's just and fair, and everyone is free to share nature's bounty and be fulfilled. And then I'm sure we'd all be thrilled. Our people also volunteer. Together, all of us can steer a world in which there's harmony between business and society, benefiting every group. And once again, our CSR can serve to take us very far. The projects that are the biggest hits provide us with all benefits. Ingeniously, we can plan it, serve profit, people, and planet. Sustainability is not a pain, for after all, it is a gain. It helps us all to survive, last long, as well as to thrive. It's a license to operate. The ecosystem finds its great. Society, governments, banks cooperate, convey their thanks. Together, with both heart and brain, sustainably, let's sustain. With ESG spends, nothing's lost, as benefits outweigh the cost. And governance also pays. It's an effort in the early days, but over time you are rewarded. Implicit trust is awarded. The values for which you stand help to enhance your brand. You must persist and never balk. Consistently walk the talk. If your governance is strong, the payback won't be very long. Always keep these facts in sight. Don't hesitate to do what's right. The strategy is tried and tested. In the long haul, it can't be bested. Now, ESG will take you far. Don't just be a shooting star, rising high before you fall. Instead, take the enduring call. All of us can forge ahead if we only learn to shed the barriers that can divide, and if cooperation's tried. With the help of business, I foresee a helpful, thriving society. Thank you.
Sir, if this was a physical meeting, you would have seen a standing ovation. It is absolutely remarkable that the entire ESG has been put in the form of verse, and we appeal to you and request you to please make available the hard copy of this, because we would like to widely circulate it, and we would like your secretary to mail it to me, and I would like to please. It'll be a great honor for us to widely circulate it. And
yes,
it's amazing. Sir, we would like to know if you will have a few minutes to take a couple of questions.
certainly.
Okay. Mr. Sundaresan?
Yeah, Press. Thank you. And Mr. Godrej, it was just wonderful. So I would just like to ask one question, which is from your experience, from Godrej experience. Where do you see this ESG heading to, and what are the challenges that you see in the ESG implementation program?
As far as we see, we don't see any challenge because we've already seen the benefits. We have been working on governance for a very long time on our Good and Green program since 2010. Both have been very useful. They're very satisfying. Employees are delighted that we do that. Even shareholders are delighted that we do that. And now there are many companies who are still not convinced, but more and more people realize that good ESG practices gives you better multiples. So I think we should pass on this message that it is not a question of doing all these things at the expense of profits, but it is doing these things intelligently in a way that improves your profits.
Thank you.
I would like to ask a question, Mr. Godrej, if you kindly permit. At the end of, at the heart of governance is the board of directors. Everybody knows about it. And we operate in an ecosystem. We have to be very conscious about the environment. And CSR typically talks about the social aspects of governance. Then what intrigues me is what would be the level of involvement of the board in ensuring ESG implementation when in fact SEBI seems to think it is the baby of the risk committee? I just wanted to understand from you.
Yes, I think all the board should be interested in that. And of course, we have risk committees, CSR committees, and they all report into the board. The board should be very keen on promoting this, but I think promoters also should be very keen. In India, most businesses are promoter-led. So the promoters should also be very keen, and they should select board members who can provide inputs on ESG. Board members who have environmental skills, board members who have social skills, and board members who are passionate about governance.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to put a question? Mr. Godrej has another meeting, as I'm told, but I'm sure he can take one more question if someone has. Yep. Yes, Banu.
If I may, I'll probably go one. Mr. Godrej, if you have to probably guide the management, what are the two things which you think they should adopt first?
I think energy efficiency is a complete win-win. That is the easiest part of ESG because it directly goes into profits. And any kind of waste elimination by design, you design your processes in such a way that less waste is produced. You rethink how you do business so that you do not produce waste. Those are both good for the environment and good for efficiency. So you have to find synergy between your social obligations and your profit obligation. And believe me, there are many synergies.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Godrej, for being with us. And I look forward to receiving the hard copy of this wonderful presentation. In fact, you may not have seen the chat box.
No, I haven't seen the chat box.
Unanimously, people are saying this is the best ever keynote address they have heard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm delighted, and all I hope is people actually practice it.
Thank you. I'm sure they will. Thank you, sir.
I will send you the soft copy soon.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, sir. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we move on to a special address by Mr. Swarup Mohanty. Mr. Mohanty is the Chief Executive Officer and Associate Director of Mirae Asset Investment Managers India Private Limited. He has over 27 years of experience in the field of financial services, including 20 years plus experience in asset management sales. He is overall responsible for the India AMC. He has been associated with the AMC as a head sales from July 2011. Prior to this assignment, Mr. Mohanty was national sales head retail with Religare Asset Management Company Limited. He has also been associated with organizations like Aditya Birla Sun Life AMC Limited, Franklin Templeton Asset Management, Kotak Mahindra Asset Management Company in sales responsibilities. Mr. Mohanty holds a degree in PGDBM and BCom honors. He is also director of Mirae Asset Global Investments Private Limited, Mirae Asset Venture Investments Private Limited, Mirae Asset Financial Service India Private Limited. Mr. Mohanty has a very good understanding of ESG from an investor's point of view, and we are very eager to listen to what Mr. Mohanty has to say over the next 15 minutes. Mr. Mohanty, welcome you, sir. Thank you very much for being with us today. And please, may I request you to deliver your special address? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prasanna, for the opportunity. On behalf of Mirae Asset, I'd like to thank IOD for this great opportunity to speak, and more important, sharing space with Mr. Godrej, because what he did just before me is at a different level. I will second, not only second, that is the best keynote I've ever heard, but I never thought that a keynote could be presented in such a manner. And it's an absolute honor to be there. It will go down as one of my highlights in my career. And really thanks to Mr. Balakrishnan for this huge opportunity, because it's a very interesting time in India. And of course, what I'm going to speak will be completely contrasting to what Mr. Godrej put on the table. There is nothing matching that. So please be ready for 15-20 minutes of boring spiel from my side. Because when you started talking about ESG, and I started discussing or learning about ESG some 4 or 5 years ago, because we thought from a global perspective, it was time that India started discussing it. And we thought we'll bring the fund to India and work on it. But when and this is just sharing my experience with all of you, nothing personal or anything. This is just what we've gone through over the last 5 years. And some of it, I think, summed up what Mr. Godrej has to say, is that, when we started discussing ESG, the perception was it was something associated with charity. People definitely believe that doing good and making money don't go together. And then it is this thought of integrating the people and planet, which will lead to making profits, is something which was alien to India some 5-6 years ago. But this is what ESG is, and it's the integration of the people of an organization, both internally and externally, caring about the planet around you, which will lead to enhanced profits, is what is this phenomenal term of ESG, which brings about, everybody knows it's just the economic or the social and the governance part of the business, but it is the integration of the 3 Ps as we look at it. And no wonder, when you look at it from a geographical spread worldwide, it is countries which have imbibed this earlier in their lives, which have woken up earlier to ESG. When you look at the European countries, or from whether it's European, UK, Canada, these are the 3 large outlays of ESG, whether it's from companies which have imbibed or considered themselves ESG compliant, and to investors who now have taken to ethical investing, sustainable investing, as they call it. These are the last 3 parts, but you have the eastern side of the world now waking up. You also have US now catching up very quickly. And probably when you look at the ethos of these parts of the world, they've been hit more by climate, they've been hit more by diversity, that the imbibing of this concept has been a little ahead of the rest of the world. But when you look at the concept and when you sort of concise what Mr. Godrej had to say, it is just exactly what this slide is all about. It is doing something good in the form of CSR, which brings a very different perspective to organizations, which lead to, better employment or better employee satisfaction within the organization. It does develop a brand image and leads to attraction of customers to a certain ESG compliant company. And by allocating capital to more promising and sustaining ideas, an organization can enhance its own returns. So to sum it up, when you look at good investing and asset optimization, you put that along with employee productivity upliftment, which reduces your regulatory risks. It definitely leads to cost reduction, and hence it leads to top line growth. What it does on a sustainable basis, it does lower business risk, and that then leads to sustainable growth. And Mr. Godrej rightfully said, it is a shift of mindset. And once that mindset shift happens, this is the result of what can happen in India in the next 5-10 years. What it has done to companies globally is that 63% of studies indicate that there is a direct positive impact of ESG on financial performance. It does, facilitate reduction of cost of capital for companies. It does lead to the fact that your cost of equity does come down. And that is the good part of ESG from people who look at it from a profit perspective. But when you look at the output or the performance of these companies on the markets, it is becoming quite imperative that over a period of time, the ESG stocks continue to outperform the non-ESG stocks. And this is across the globe. Whether you look at the global large cap blend equity, nearly 77% of ESG funds are outperforming their counterparts in the market on a 5-year horizon. If you come to the same comparison to the US large cap blended equity, nearly 81% of ESG funds are outperforming their contemporaries in the market. The European large cap blend is also in the similar way. Nearly half of the ESG funds are outperforming the market. And it's a trend which is following a global sort of trend. And when you look at it from an Indian perspective, it is not as what it was just 5 years ago. The Google search on the term ESG is just on the rise, and the last 4 or 5 years has seen a multiple growth, not only in the discussions of ESG, which we are just seeing now, but also in the knowledge or the people seeking knowledge about ESG is on the uptrend. When you look at the broad landscape, and this, as Mr. Prasanna rightfully pointed out, I'm looking at it from the investment and the investor perspective. When you look at the scenario in 2009 and the regulatory environment around it, the MCA first released the voluntary guidelines of CSR. In 2021, SEBI has mandated the top 1,000 listed companies to implement BRR. In 2009, there were absolutely no funds managed by asset managers with an ESG mandate. In 2021, there are 9 funds and counting, and the AUM is continuously on the upside. It's just crossed around 12,000 crores as we speak. And the inflow into ESG funds continues to grow. The best part of what is happening in India as a landscape is when you look at just 2009, there were absolutely no in-house ESG rating agencies, and there was complete reliance on global ESG rating agencies for a score. Today, as we speak, based on the BRR report as a starting point, there are domestic ESG rating agencies involved. I've been very fortunate to be involved in most of these forums, and I can speak from experience that each by the day, we are seeing an increased enhancement of the recognition, not only recognition of it from a regulator perspective, but what the regulator had to say was the willingness with which the BRR report came out from the top 1,000 companies of India was a surprise to all of us. Not only were they willing to share the data, but the pride with which some of the corporates, and you saw a little bit of it, not a little bit, a lot of it in Mr. Godrej's speech, is I've been witnessing that across a lot of the top companies in India. And the willingness and the pride with which they're sharing this data is something which just showcases what this will become in the next 5-10 years. But here is the thing, when you look at investing, ESG takes off where Indian investing stopped. It is where financial ends that ESG start. There was this great statement by Mr. Edward Deming that, in God we trust, rest have to be backed by data. And this is what ESG does. It brings the data to a lot of intangibles. And that is the power of what it can bring and change the landscape perpetually. I mean, how do you account for, you can say, yes, I'm good in greenhouse emission, but you're now going to get the data on it. You can say that I have a whistleblower policy, but are you actually implementing the whistleblower policy is something which will come about. And then, I can go on naming the factors, but I'm told some 150 non-financial factors are tracked by analysts to form an ESG score. And then it brings to it a far bigger comprehensiveness, which is far beyond just the profits that the companies generate. Hence, it gives a very wholesome nature to that organization, which leads to that term called sustainable. And it's natural that if you track this 150 factors, we talked about diversity. Diversity in India is still gender. But when you look at what diversity ESG tracks is far beyond gender. It's religious diversity, education diversity. Are we looking at education in a bigger way? Are we looking at learning disability in a bigger way? And practice it is an organization. And then it takes the organization to a different level. But let's talk facts. And when you look at the broad challenge of ESG, and it's very top down, as Mr. Godrej rightfully said. It is now concentrating on corporate governance in a very different way. As I said, it gives a score. And when you look at the score, these 4 factors which the OECD put in place, which is the right and equitable treatment of shareholders, that is the external shareholders, the role of stakeholders in corporate governance, the disclosure and transparency, and the responsibility of the board. I think Mr. Prasanna hinted at the responsibility of the board. I feel the role of the board is where the difference will come going forward. And then, yes, we all know that our regulator is very persistent on disclosure and transparency. So when you look at India, the disclosure and transparency is on a high, because I can conclude that you're pushed to do it. But the other 3 facts, and when you look at the other 3 facts and you compare it to a global standard, we have a long way to go. Broadly in 2019, when you look at these factors and the score, we are trailing the global standard of 70. We are touching the global standard of 70 only in disclosure and transparency. But when it comes to rights of shareholders, the role of stakeholders, or the responsibility of the boards, still a long way to go. And I think it is when you track, and when the cost of funds, or when the external inflow on equity goes, converges on ESG, that we will see definite cognizance of this, and it's on the rise. What does it mean? And when it means that, when these are simple things, when you look at the role of, say, the external stakeholders, it can mean that does the company have a policy requiring all related parties to be dealt on, or especially the role of the independent members? Did all board members attend the previous AGM? Did all external auditors participate in previous AGMs? These are small things, but when it is done on a consistent basis, and when it is tracked, and when you know that a mishap on this will lead to a deterrence of your score, that things like this fall into place. And it is very important that these small things then add up to the big thing of sustainable management. And then a very important thing which Mr. Godrej pointed out, that India is a country of promoters, individual promoters. So there is that backlog that we carry, and then it will get bridged is something which we firmly believe going forward. And if you look at just carrying that basic thing forward, does the company have a policy of disclosing policies or mechanism to address health? We've gone through probably one of the worst health pandemics that we've seen. Now, trust me, every HR was under pressure for vaccinating people. All the company employees who were not vaccinated by the companies were standing up and saying, what is our company doing? And people who took the leap on that clearly demonstrated better employee satisfaction. And these things lead to retention of people, and retention of people is what leads to better businesses. Do companies have a whistleblower policy? All of them have whistleblower policies. Do they practice it? If they are practicing it, what is the effect of that practice? Is something which tracks down ESG. And just to carry it forward, and I don't have much time, so let me just hurry it a little. And here, because we are concentrating a bit on the board part, is that the role of the board as we speak and post ESG stands permanently changed. I think Mr. Prasanna raised a very interesting thing, that this is part of the risk forum of the regulator. I don't see it restricted to the risk forum in the short run. It will get changed very quickly. The fact that it is recognized by the regulator is a starting point. It will evolve, and it will evolve very quickly. Is there a separation between the role of the chairperson and the CEO? There is the GN Gupta committee, which was just tabled last week with NSC, and please have a look at that and see how it now differentiates between the managing director, the CEO, the whole-time director, and the independent director. It takes the responsibility of the board to check whether the compensation of the CEO is in line with the company's performance. And all this will be tracked. Does the company have a strong and robust internal audit framework? You can say yes, but it will be given a score. Yes or no, and you will be compared with your peer, and a relative score will be given. So you can compare yourself as to how you stand with the rest of your industry and across industries. Does the company have a succession plan? And that's very important from an Indian context. Does it have a succession plan for its directors and senior leadership? In a top-down environment like India, It is probably one of the most important part when you look at the growth of any corporate and how it will play out going forward. And this is how we score. And I am really looking forward to learning from the rest of the discussions, because we are not very good as we stand. When you look at the leadership, though we have scored 11, which is a score higher than what we were in 2019, we still, when you look at our basic score, our score is below par in a lot of these factors, whether it's going to a score on leadership, whether it's a score on disclosure, whether it's a score of corporate governance, whether it's the only place where we score high is disclosure. So while we welcome ESG in a broad concept, the next 5-10 years we'll see the practice of ESG, because what will happen, a good ESG score company will be rated highly in the stock market. It will lead to lower cost of capital for them. And once these external factors kick in, we will see the practice of ESG evolving in the next 5-10 years. And we're very fortunate to have a fund with us. And hence we get to know how corporates are tracked. Yes, what we look forward is a standardized ESG tracking mechanism. And if that unfolds on the behest of the powers to be, a lot can happen in India is our simple submission. So thank you so much for making me part of this August gathering, and really appreciate all the time that was given to me.
Thank you, Swaroop. In fact, you spoke from your heart. And in fact, if you had spent time on each one of those points that you made on the slide, maybe we would require another hour. But thank you for putting across the most important aspects of your perception as an investor, and as to what investors are going to increasingly looking at. I would certainly have time for a couple of questions for you, and if has anyone a particular question to ask Swaroop?
Yeah, Chris.
Yes.
Today I'm sitting on the other side, so only questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Swaroop, last 20 years, when as an investor you open the annual report, the focus was on corporate governance.
Right, sir.
Looks like from 2021, the complete shift is on ESG. Okay, we just started. But tell me, as an investor, how can I impress you in my annual report on the ESG reporting?
Sir, actually, the beauty of the future is that it will completely be contrasting to the way it was in the past. The recognition of ESG was negligent as a score. But when we look at investing, what will first happen is that there will be a cutoff of scores. This is not just for ESG funds. It will get as I can speak for Mirae Asset, and we are just in the process of imbibing a global ESG practice across all our funds. So it will extend to other funds also. Maybe to begin with, it will be restricted to the top half of the industry, the larger companies, and across sectors. Every fund will have a basic cutoff of the ESG score. And see, we can till now from an analyst perspective, and let's look at the Indian landscape. From our analyst perspective, we cover the financials quite well. We get a glimpse of what the corporate governance is by talking to the top management for a while. It's not a lengthy talk, but invariably we talk and come to a conclusion. But what this will give is a broad score of the practice across the organization. And there will be certain scores which will be tracked by everybody. And once that standardization is made, especially when you look at the independence of the company, because India comes from that track record of being promoter driven. So when you look at the independence of management of that company, something which all of us will look forward to. I mean, earlier, let's face it, we funds were not large in our holdings. Suddenly the funds are increasingly bigger in our holding of certain companies. So we have started participating in the voting, which we were not in the past. Right? So all this will start, and hopefully the ESG part and relevant scores of especially for companies which are not, and typically people feel ESG is a process of exclusion. It's actually a process of inclusion. So a lot of these industries which are not naturally part of climate or environment will have to work overtime to get this inclusion done, is something which is my submission.
So while on that, can you just give me 3 points which would give you a wow feeling and put all your money in my company?
Sir, I think going forward, some very, very interesting parts will be your emission norms, whether you're headed there or not, and the progress plan on that. Of course, it takes some time because India is a coal-dependent country, so it will take a slightly longer time than the rest of the world. But what is the plan? And are we on track of that plan is something which one has to put. I think inclusion is something which will start playing very heavily. And when I mean inclusion, it is far beyond just the gender. That will play very heavily. And more important, I think economic, your CSR or the commitment to CSR is something which will also be viewed by funds, which will obviously play a large part of your brand image in the market going forward.
Thank you. And I do think that we are just about in time to get on to our panel this thing. And thank you, Swaroop, for being with us today. And time is always a constraint, and particularly in the virtual medium, it's always a constraint. Thank you very much. And we look forward to having more interactions with you in the coming webinars, because this ESG is going to sort of engage our attention going forward. And we can get on to drill down specifics, and some could be speaking only about benchmarking, some could be speaking about how can non-financial indicators like ESG be part of a financial reporting. And it sounds like an oxymoron. And should there be a non-financial reporting as opposed to financial reporting? These are all questions that will come going forward. Otherwise, these non-financial performance indicators embedded into the financial reporting will not even be understood, will not even be noticed by the retail shareholder who has put in money like any other investor, but doesn't really measure the ESG in the way you actually measure. Anyway, it will be interesting. The field is wide open. With that, I take you on to the panel discussion. And what I propose to do is to introduce you to the moderator and to the individual panelists all in one go, so that the panel discussion goes seamlessly. And I would also like to mention to each of the panelists that the moderator will be inviting each one of you to make a presentation of your own for about 5 to 6 minutes. And after all four of you have finished your presentation, the moderator will then engage you in a discussion. And also, hopefully, there will be some time for the participants also to ask a few questions to the panelists as well. So with that, may I now introduce the moderator, Dinesh Anand. May I have his profile on the screen, please? Dinesh is the National Managing Partner, Risk at Grant Thornton, India, responsible for the forensic, internal audit, ESG, and private equity practice. He is also the global private equity leader. A results-oriented leader with 20 or more years of experience in building and leading teams and managing businesses in India, Dinesh is one of the pioneers of forensics in India and founded the first corporate intelligence practice among the Big Four in India. As a leader, he has been instrumental in building one of the most successful forensic practices in the country. Dinesh's key strengths lie in business development, network collaboration, and technology innovation. His clients include major private equity firms, leading multinationals, and large Indian business conglomerates whom he has advised on various aspects of the risk. I present to you Dinesh, the moderator, and he will be moderating a panel comprising of the following people. May I have the profile of Mr. Akhil Mehrotra, please? Mr. Akhil Mehrotra is a business leader with over 29 years of experience spread across oil and gas, power and telecom industries, with more than 16 years in leadership roles. Before joining Pipeline Infrastructure Limited in 2019 as CEO and Managing Director, he was associated with companies of repute such as Shell PLC, BG PLC, Gujarat Gas Limited, and Reliance Group. Akhil is a BA Mechanical Engineering graduate, MBA in Finance, and PhD in Gas Markets, apart from completing a management program from IIM Bangalore. He has in his name a gamut of specialized courses from esteemed global institutions like the Harvard Business School, Kellogg School of Management, and the London Business School as well. Akhil has held several significant positions over the years. He was the chairman at Mahanagar Gas Limited, a Fortune 500 company, in the year 2017 and 18. He has also been on boards of many respected organizations, including Shell Energy India Private Limited and Hazira Ports Private Limited. He is currently the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer at Pipeline Infrastructure. The next panelist, may I have his profile, Mr. Ulysses Smith. Mr. Ulysses Smith is a ESG senior advisor to a Whiteshore law firm based in New York and London, Debevoise and Plimpton, which is a well-known international law firm. Ulysses was formerly president and CEO of Telos Governance Advisors, advancing good governance in sustainable economic and social development, advising businesses, governments, multilaterals, and not-for-profit organizations, and contributing to sustainable development, eradicating corruption, and promoting compliance, and establishing rule of law and promoting human rights. In April 2018, he was appointed as director of the Business and Rule of Law program at the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law. In September 2017, he was appointed as special advisor to the United Nations Global Compact on Anti-Corruption and Global Governance. In 2016, he was recognized by the United Nations Global Compact as one of 10 global sustainable development goal pioneers for his work to advance progress with Sustainable Development Goals 16 elements of governance, the rule of law, anti-corruption, and peace and security. And that is Mr. Ulysses. May I have the profile of the next panelist, Shresha George, please. Shresha is managing director and partner at the Boston Consulting Group. She has extensive experience in supporting senior leaders in technology, financial services, and growth tech industries. She specializes in helping clients transform by strengthening their people, technology, and data capabilities. Her focus is to go beyond strategy and make lasting change happen within the organization. Her passionate about sustainable business models and advising clients on their ESG ambitions. Since joining BCG in 2008, she has split time between Australia and India systems. Most recently, she has been pivotal in setting up and leading BCG's Bangalore office. And if I may add, I've heard Shresha talking to the mighty board of directors, and that was one of the best presentations that I have seen on ESG so far. Thank you, Shresha, for being with us today. May I have the next profile, please? Richa. Richa is a business transformation leader with deep understanding of strategy, marketing, and operations in the consumer goods space. She has driven significant results for businesses in her career of 30 plus years, building businesses and brands from scratch, nurturing them at inception and scaling up established ones. Richa has recently joined eCube Investment Advisors as managing partner and CEO, ESG Stewardship Services. In this entrepreneurial venture, her mandate is to drive the strategy and implementation of environmental social governance assessment and engagement. Prior to eCube, Richa was with the Tata Group, where as COO, she led the transformation of the consumer business of Tata Chemicals. Launching Tata Sampan, building the food portfolio beyond salt, upgrading the backend infrastructure, creating the content to commerce platform NutriCorner, and driving an industry-first recyclable pack for Tata Salt have been some of the highlights of her stint. Besides business, Richa is passionate about photography. She has had solo exhibition in India at the Lalit Kala Academy. Excuse me. A graduate in economics and an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, Richa is a Chevening scholar from the London School of Economics. She has also completed Directors Club, the Independent Board Director Certification Program of Hunt Partners. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and welcome Dinesh and his panel of experts. Over to Dinesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prasanna, and thank you to the Institute of Directors for inviting me to moderate this panel discussion. If I may speak on behalf of our panel, we have big shoes to fill after hearing. I'm still spellbound after hearing Mr. Godrej's opening, and of course, Mr. Mohanty's comments on what companies need to do from an ESG perspective. But I guess one of the key elements before I come to the panel is that why are we discussing, why is there so much prominence to ESG? And I believe it is because every day we are being faced with clear indications that we are reaching the tipping point. We are all living in cities in India where we are either facing huge pollution problems or groundwater shortages. We are seeing the havoc climate change is causing in the world by, with the earth temperatures increasing and unexpected cyclones, wildfires, which are threatening livelihoods and further making, resources less for everyone to take. I think the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused extreme amount of damage and sorrow because lives and livelihoods were lost, has only heightened the need for corporate India now to focus on the environment and social of ESG. With India signing now, that by 2070, we will be carbon neutral. And like Mr. Mohanty mentioned, that it is no better time than now for corporate India to transform and look at their business strategies by making ESG inclusive to become resilient, sustainable, and ensure long-term value creations for the stakeholders. The question which at least I've been asked by many of my clients is, where do we start, right? If you look at most of the listed companies, they have integrated ESG by focusing on sustainable development goals, which was also adopted by the United Nations many years back. There are many which are looking for guidance on where to start. However, as Mr. Godrej has mentioned, in order to integrate ESG in their day-to-day business strategies, companies in India need to move beyond compliance to regulations, but focus on how they are going to treat the planet and its resources, its responsibilities to its workers and communities, and have a zero tolerance to unethical business. I think the role of corporate governance, which has always been very high, will continue to be very high. And of course, as mentioned by Mr. Mohanty and everybody else, the role of the board is only going to become more and more important. I think with that, to answer and also on where to begin, I have my illustrious panel of industry experts who are going to share their insights on how business can approach their ESG journey, what challenges and opportunities are likely to come up in this journey, and what are the practical solutions to manage and tap the opportunities that lie ahead. With that, welcome to the panel. And my first question is to Ulysses, that given your global experience and given the fact that you have been advising clients sitting in New York and London, can you please share some global context on the importance of ESG and what you're seeing in these markets?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I think the first thing just to say is that it's really an honor to be with you all. Good afternoon. I hope you've had a wonderful session so far. I've only been able to join a little bit of the last segment. It's quite early in New York where I am, but it was a fascinating discussion, and I'm really pleased to be with you. I think the first thing to say about ESG internationally, and it's perhaps a little bit stating the obvious, is just how much is going on, how much energy there is, how well established and mainstream ESG has become in just what's really a short amount of time. 5 years ago, I would say ESG was quite niche. It was fairly obscure. And today there's widespread understanding of both the trillions of dollars of opportunity that's out there for business and for investors to build the infrastructure and develop the sources of energy in the economies that will deliver a sustainable future. That kind of evolution in such a short amount of time is quite extraordinary. The second thing that I'd say, again, at that international level, is just the variety of drivers of the main developments around ESG. That comes from many different sources. I understood from an earlier part of the program, focus on sort of a top-down aspect of that, but it's also very bottom-up. We see an expansive increase in law and regulation in the ESG space. Broadly, the evolution has been from a series of sort of soft law sources, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines for multinationals, being succeeded with a variety of hard law sources, such as the UK Modern Slavery Act or the French Loi de Vigilance or the German Supply Chains Act. More specifically, there have been a variety of EU ESG related rulemaking that's happened over the last couple of years. And, in the US where I'm at, it's a little bit of a playing catch up story, but there is a lot that's going on, including the creation earlier this year of an ESG and climate task force within the SEC's enforcement division. The task of which is basically to review the disclosures that filing companies, listed companies in the US have made around climate and ESG for issues of greenwashing or exaggerated statements, misstatements in their filings. And the main event, which looks like is probably not going to happen now until 2022, is quite significant climate-related disclosure rules that the SEC will be putting out. There's similar developments happening in Australia, Hong Kong, Latin American countries, et cetera. And I think the point is just that a governance space that has previously been defined by principles and guidelines and voluntary frameworks is increasingly shifting and becoming a space that's defined by hard law with the consequent legal and regulatory risks that come with it. But just to say, law and regulation is not the only source of the developments that are impacting the ESG world. And indeed, I tend to think of them as not the primary source. It's more of a bottom-up phenomenon. Firstly, the investment community is increasingly directing capital toward enterprises that do well on a variety of ESG factors. Investors want to understand the ESG impacts of their investments. And this is true for retail investors, but also for institutional investors. And therefore, portfolio companies are being required to provide ESG-related information to their investors. On the other hand, businesses that tend to perform poorly on ESG matters are finding that their costs of capital are increasing, and in fact, it's becoming increasingly difficult to attract investors. In addition, on shareholders, 2021 in the US saw a dramatic increase in ESG-related shareholder proposals, as well as ESG-driven board proposals being surprisingly successful. I imagine that there might have been some coverage of the famous Engine 1 campaign focused on the board composition of ExxonMobil. That is just one of the more noteworthy examples, but there are others. And in the US, 2022 is expected to see only an increase of such ESG-related activity, partly due to the success of those efforts in 2021, but also because of developments that have happened at the SEC in the US, which has the effect of essentially lowering the bar for consideration of ESG shareholder proposals. Finally, I think an important thing to note, again, at the international level, as a driver of the ESG trends we see, is the effect of civil society and the role of social activist groups. In the US, 2021 saw a huge increase in calls by civil society and activist groups for businesses to be more active and outspoken on environmental, social, and governance issues. And it seems to me that this trend is only going to continue as the challenges that were just identified in the introduction to this panel are not going anywhere. And the facts of carbon and climate change and resource depletion is only going to become more severe. And I think rally communities around these issues, and that will result in calls for the business community to be a part of the solution. So I just to say, and then I'll stop, and we look forward to your questions and the discussion that follows, is just that the landscape that's emerging at the global level is one of both risk and challenge. Of course, as the transition from soft law to hard law takes place, that means more laws and regulations to comply with, more risk of non-compliance, more risk of enforcement action, and that's certainly true. On the other hand, it's a significant amount of opportunity for companies that are able to capitalize and nimbly navigate the legal and regulatory and reputational risks that come with it. Immense opportunities in terms of developing the products and services that are going to be needed to drive this transition to a sustainable future. Significant potential for drawing and retaining talent and a customer base. So I think it's important to not lose sight, even though as a lawyer, we tend to focus more on the requirements and the compliance risk to really keep front and center the opportunities that ESG represents for businesses around the world. So once again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Ulysses. A very interesting point you brought out, at least from a global context, that everybody is moving from voluntary disclosures reporting to enforcement. I personally think sometimes having enforcement at the same time when you start getting people to start disclosing can only speeden up the process, and I think maybe regulators should be looking in that direction. With that, I'd like to move on to Akhil. Akhil, what's the and this was the point which Ulysses also mentioned, that there is this huge emphasis which investors are today putting on the importance of ESG on companies. What is it that you are seeing in terms of the investor view on importance of ESG and the value it brings? It'll be great for you to share some experiences.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this esteemed panel and listening to others. First, let me tell you some facts about ESG, and which will clearly link to why investors are more and more, I'll say, worried about ESG and looking at ESG as a parameter before we go and invest in any asset or any company. The first thing is that there have been 70% of around 2,000 plus academic studies around the world have proven there's a clear positive correlation between ESG performance and the financial returns. And these financial returns can be measured as equity returns or profitability or valuation multiples. And I think other speakers have also said about this kind of. The second part is that the studies also tell us that the cost of capital of companies which have better focus on ESG and better governed is 10% lower. So the cost of capital itself goes 10% lower. So it is obvious by all these studies that it's not just good to have. ESG is not something which was thought of that it is done for the good of the society. No, it brings good profits. So it makes sense for all of us who kind of invest big into a lot of assets to look at all risk and opportunities which an ESG brings while evaluating any business for any investments. And why this is important is while we look at the financial metrics. Earlier, the company used to look at only at the balance sheet financial metrics to say, okay, whether the company is good and bad. But in more specific terms, when we evaluate businesses and look at the ESG risk, some of these ESG risks you'll not be able to see from the financial statements. And I'll explain that in some time, what are these and why it is very important for any investor and any company to really look at the ESG side also. But while in short, what I can say is that we look at ESG while investing at a pre-investment level and a post-investment level. And then pre-investment, first of all, and I think there was a question earlier also, people say, what do you see? Is there any metrics? But really what we go and do is have a very deep and thorough understanding of all ESG risk and opportunities for any companies. And this can be different for different set of companies, and depending on the sector where the companies, it can't be a one kind of formula which can apply to all. And for example, let me say that if I'm buying an asset which is facing a regulatory headwind, and maybe because of not managing its carbon footprint or polluting environment, obviously there is a risk to this company itself, which may not be visible in my financial statements at that juncture, right? So that's very important to really understand what are the risks which this company is facing in terms of ESG areas, kind of, right? We also try to understand the whole impact on the society, because why it is important is because where the companies operate, you have a full impact on society, and the license to operate, which we call LTO, is impacted by any environmental impact the company may have, the impact on society which you have, and obviously the governance standards. And I'm not talking much of governance because that's much better understood. What is coming now is more on the S side of this, and then we have been monitoring more on S and G, kind of, right? But just for the clarity of all the participants in this discussion, people tell me that, look, how do you link ESG to cash flows, right? Because it is good to talk. So let me give you two examples. First is top line, right? Let's talk of revenues, and that's if you want to increase revenue, how does revenue get impacted with ESG? Now, if we have a better relationship with the community and stakeholders, this relationship itself can allow a company to have increased access to the resources. Now, these resources can be natural resources in the cases of natural resource company, or local manpower, or so many other things, kind of, right? So a top line growth can be achieved through a proper ESG kind of focus. So that's on the revenue side. Coming on the cost side, and I think earlier speakers have, this is much easier to understand. We can do a lot of things on the cost side, and I think Mr. Godrej said that other speakers, the easiest one is energy efficiency, right? So it will reduce your cost, but we also seen you can reduce waste and losses in a lot of areas. You can recycle things, you can reuse things. A lot of efforts are going into these areas. It's not well understood, but you can, by proper governance, you can reduce your regulatory cost and by avoiding unnecessary litigations, kind of. So these are some of the examples which say that good ESG and focus on ESG links to my bottom line, kind of, right? And in the end, it's very important that all these will link to the employee morale by linking the purpose of the company to why you are doing these societal benefits. And I'm talking more of the S part and the ESG here, kind of. But when we do all this, we do face a lot of challenges. There have been a lot of norms by SEBI and all, but again, when we try to integrate this matrix into my investment decisions, we do still are facing some challenge, especially on the qualitative side of the decisions, that how do we really integrate it? And we're trying to make sense around it. But at least what it does is it throws out all the risk and opportunities, bring all that in the table, and then we are able to make more informed decision as an investor, kind of, right? I'll pause there, but in the end, I'll say that as investors and as companies, we are looking at a definition of ROI in a different way. It was earlier return on investment. Now I'm saying it is RI, which is a responsible investment, kind of, right? So I'll pause there and kind of happy to hear others.
No, thank you, Akhil. And with that, I want to move on to Shesha, what Akhil mentioned in the end on responsible investing. And Shesha, it'll be great to hear your views on ESG benchmarking and scoring, and how investors are guided to do responsible investing.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on the panel. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think we've heard, thank you, Akhil, for setting up so well on why this is important. And we've seen that, right, whether it's across media or even in our conversations or the number of webinars we're doing on the topic. It's really come to the forefront, but it's still quite a mysterious topic because there are so many elements and angles to it. I think one, maybe just a data point to add, from an investor's perspective, because you specifically asked about responsible investing, we had recently done a survey of US asset managers. So about 1,000 asset managers in the US, and asked them, how are you thinking about ESG as a topic? And about 33% or 1/3 of the population came back saying 20% of their current asset book has either gotten lost or is at risk of being lost because they don't have the right ESG capabilities. So this is, no more a discussion of a nice to have. This is here to stay. And hence the whole thought process into how do you manage this from whether it's a scoring or a benchmarking perspective, but more, more broadly, how do you make this real? And the big thing that plays here when it comes to investing is every industry and every company has a slightly different agenda. So what is most critical for anybody listening on this webinar is really to understand what are the material ESG topics that drive that industry. And it is very different. So let me just take an example of, some of our heavy polluters, right? So if we take a mining company, for example, the material topics for ESG are fundamentally different from if I was going to talk about a technology company. And we can't broad base and say, ESG is important. And I think there was a great question before the panel started on how do I wow an investor? How do I really wow an investor with my report? I wow the investor with two things. One is by talking about material topics to my industry and my company. And two, by being authentic. These are really two legs to actually make the investing agenda come real. If it's a long-term, a long-term infrastructure project, if it's a port, when it comes to scoring and benchmarking those, there are very clear, I think we've gotten a bit more maturity around some of those metrics because clearly these days we understand that there's a clear risk to the climate, there's a clear risk to the environment. We are polluting the environment in such a way, or as defined earlier, there is a whole gamut of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions that have been defined. And we put targets around it and have a clear pathway, whether it's 2020, 2030, or 2070, right? Depending on, there is a pathway to get there. Versus a technology company where actually for many people, it's still quite a mystery on what is material topics for a technology company. It's not climate is important, but they're not heavy emitters. But what is material to them is actually a plethora of different things. So it is important that they reduce their footprint and contribute to climate, but many elements of social, because they're very people heavy industry. So, diversity, inclusion becomes very critical for them. Some of these governance disclosures, the whole data privacy and security become very important for them. So if we were to step back and look at, the definition of ESG, and there are many parameters which are defined. If you look at a SASB framework, which is one of the global frameworks, there are about 200 parameters. What is, a good next step or the right way to get into this is to say, out of these 200, what's the 10 or 15 or 20 that's important to me as a company? And hence, these are the areas that I will prioritize and I will invest in it. So that is one way to, really make this real in terms of what it means to invest in this area and think about your own scoring and benchmarking.
Thank you, Shesha. Just a question for you before I move on is what would be, and you touched upon a very relevant point that the ESG materiality will differ, and that is very true depending on which sector you are operating upon. But we've also seen that when listed companies are being rated, there are two norms. One is where you voluntarily give data and let yourself be listed, and the second are that today there are enough companies out there which are doing, giving you ratings based on whatever they can find in the public domain, whatever documents you have uploaded on the websites, etc. So the question I would have for you is, what's your advice for companies which are listening in? right? Should you be waiting to be rated, or should you be proactive and start identifying what are those few material focus areas within, whether it's E, S, or G, which you want to focus on, and start, get yourself rated, so that only allows you then to figure out what you need to do to be able to improve going forward. What would be your advice?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Dinesh. Great question. And, I think this one is very clear in terms of be proactive. The ESG landscape currently is a lot of unstructured data. So there are some rating agencies, but a lot of elements are still unclear on what really drives these rating agencies. Many investors find it a black box on, CRISIL has rated you X versus CDP has rated you Y versus somebody else. It almost is the role of the company now to kind of be proactive and shape this agenda for themselves, rather than be thrown into the gamut of rating agencies, just because, we are still very early in the maturity stage of this market. So yes, my direction would be proactive. You can shape the discussion with your investors. This is a great topic to actually have broader discussions and shape the roadmap going forward as well. Being a leader rather than complying is surely the path to take.
No, thank you, Shresha. So be proactive. I completely agree with you. And with that, I want to move on to Richa. And Richa, stewardship is something which we are now hearing about becoming more and more prominent from an ESG perspective. What is it that you are seeing from a trend in India? Both from external stakeholders as well as from an internal stakeholders.
Thanks, Dinesh. And firstly, thank you to IOD and Grant Thornton for inviting me for this panel. It's been a delight listening to these varied, layers within ESG, which are very important to kind of for all of us to come together and in some ways understand collectively, though we're coming all from different ends. So, Dinesh, when we talk about stewardship, it's one needs to look at it as a process of really leadership and a management mindset to help drive sustainable businesses. And just now Shresha spoke about proactiveness, and I think that's a very core part of stewardship. It's about how you responsibly allocate, how you have an oversight and governance of all your physical, social, natural resources, so that you're able to maintain that growth and resilience for the company's future, for the and of course for the investors, for the portfolio of companies which they invest in, leading to benefits not just for the company, but economy, environment, society. Now, in a scenario when environment and social regulations are still evolving, and that is certainly the case in India, stewardship becomes even more important to practice and achieve sustainability. So embedded in the concept of stewardship is really a very proactive approach. And when you look at India through this lens, undoubtedly we are at a point of inflection for ESG. The mood and environment, pun unintended, have a big role to play here, and the mood is bullish. At a country level, Indian PM has announced the deepening commitment to climate at the Glasgow COP26. Niti Aayog has been tasked with tracking India's SDG performance. So there is a purpose and a mission statement, as it were, at a country level. And this should lead certainly to a wider set of companies, investors, embracing this way of doing business. But as of now, if you look at it, it's really push factors which are driving, ESG, sustainability, stewardship in India. We've all spoken about the regulatory push which is coming in, the BRSR, which is for the top 1,000 companies going to become compulsory from next year, so to say, but it's also going to trickle down to the next lot of companies. As we speak, SEBI and various committees, technical committees are working on sector-wise disclosures, to the aspect of materiality really being different in different sectors. So instead of a one-size-fits-all, I think more specific, sharper sector-wise disclosures are going to become, the norm as these get rolled out over the very near future. So the regulatory push is certainly playing its part. I think there's an investor interest and push, and we've heard everyone, many people on this panel talk about that, and everyone is incorporating, or at least the long-term institutional investors and asset managers are incorporating ESG risks in their decision-making process, and that's showing in the figures for responsible investment and so on. I think there's a third factor which doesn't get spoken about much, and that is what I call consumer consciousness. Climate change, and Dinesh, you touched upon it. It's very real. It's upon us. We experience it every day, and it's really the number one concern among both millennials and Gen Z. This new generation of environmentally conscious consumers is growing across the world, and that's true of India also. We tend to think that India is, a little behind on this. It may be behind on ESG, but I think in terms of the younger generations being more climate conscious, it's very, very real. They're not just demanding more sustainable solutions, but a significant portion, if I recall a study, almost 30% are using sustainability as a criteria when they're making employment choices. So the push is working, and sometimes things start happening when there are various push factors, and that's certainly the case in India. And I think the reason why it's not been embraced to the extent it possibly should be is that this whole aspect of seeing ESG and sustainability as something sitting outside of business, and again, many people, including Mr. Godrej, touched upon it. And if we look at this as something which is done by the sustainability team or the chief sustainability officer in an organization, that is, I think, the crux of some of the barriers, if I may say, to in a sense, adoption of this. But I think this trend will only intensify, and as we start seeing more data, and one saw a lot of interesting data today, as we see the data in terms of the risks which happen in terms of raising capital, in terms of just physical risks, which will impact your PE multiple, which will impact your stock market performance and all the financial metrics. The moment it starts becoming this, a side of the same coin rather than a different coin in itself, that's when the adoption and the desire to move up the ESG performance spectrum will certainly become higher. I think the other thing I want to touch upon very briefly is that I see a bit of an obsession with scores all across. To me, the scores are a starting point. It's a means to an end, and the scores don't tell you what to do. Ultimately, it's not about that one score. It's what that score tells you disaggregated on the areas you need to work on, the material factors where you still, it's good to celebrate things where you're doing well, but what do you really do to address material factors which will have a significant impact on your performance. But overall, to kind of round off where we are and we are headed, I believe that this trend will happen in more an evolutionary manner rather than a revolutionary manner. Or this audience today, we are all interested in ESG, so we are seeing ESG as something which is all pervasive. I believe that coming from a business and a marketing background, I look at where we are on sustainability and ESG through this, the diffusion of innovation theory. I mean, ESG is a new concept, innovative concept. So you're going to have your very, innovators, which is what you're seeing. Data is for, let's say, 100 companies or 200 companies. That's really a small pool out of all the companies which are there in India, even listed companies. And then you're going to have the early adopters, and we're starting to see some of that. But the point of inflection and the big jump will really happen when the early majority, it's folks who will adopt new ideas before the average person, but they need to see evidence. And as we start building more evidence that this is a concept which works, ESG impacts your business performance, I'll see, I'm sure we'll see a lot more of this happening. So with that, over to you, and look forward to the Q&A and further discussions.
No, thank you, Richa. I think one very important point which you bought out, and I hope that happens sooner than later, is going to be the sector-wise disclosures. And that, going back to what Shesha was saying, if you really have sector-wise disclosures, it's going to only become easier for every company to be able to identify what are the ESG materialities they want to focus on. So I do hope that that happens faster than before. I liked what you said, that ESG is not about the ratings and it's not about the scores. It's really the management mindset, something which you touched upon. So, and that's something which I think everybody has touched upon. What's the tone at the top, and that's going to really determine what's the journey which you're going to take going forward. But I think I want to come back to the push factors, right? And this is something, and Ulysses, back to you, and you spoke about how from disclosures we are going to enforcement. Richa touched upon the fact that the push is not just from the regulators. We spoke about the investors, but then there is the consumers, and of course there's going to also be your customers, right? A lot of the Indian companies today are vendors to large companies, or are supplying to large companies which are international, and they all are going to have some sort of a push factor which is going to come down on it. The question for you, Ulysses, would be that what is it that you are seeing from a change in regulations, right, which are driving the importance in the US, say by SEC? And also, if you have any view on what SEBI is doing and what more can SEBI do, if you would like to share your views around there. And do you think more regulations are required across the globe for ESG transformation? And like Richa mentioned, it's going to be a revolution, and I hope it's a revolution, because I think in reality, none of us want to become. I was reading recently that we become migrants because of pollution. That's the last route which we want to take. So,
Yeah.
we really need that revolution to happen.
Well, thanks, Dinesh, for the question. I think, on the US side first specifically, as I indicated in my sort of opening response, we're kind of a little bit waiting for the main event to happen. It was expected that the SEC would come out with these what are expected to be fairly detailed climate-related disclosures. It's happening under sort of an umbrella concept of regulations around ESG more broadly, including the social and the governance. But the leading thrust of this will be focused on climate, with the S and the G to follow, in due course. That has not happened. In fact, I had a conversation the other day where there's some thought that it could happen before Christmas next week. The sort of initial draft of those regulations could be started to circulate. But it's probably a little bit early to speculate a lot about what to expect. I think there's some thoughts that it will be inspired by some of what's happening in the EU with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. My hunch is, a US approach will be less detailed and less technical than the SFDR and the EU taxonomy is, which, if you have spent any time with that, it's quite a impressive and amazing level of sort of detail and complexity around those regulations. But that will come soon, I think, from the SEC. The other thing I think just to mention, though, is that there are other things happening on the regulatory and enforcement side in the US. It's not just an SEC game. We're seeing things like the Federal Trade Commission for the first time starting to ask questions when they're reviewing mergers and acquisitions, sort of antitrust reviews related to ESG. There are different parts of the government that are sort of really starting to focus on that. And as mentioned, this enforcement task force, they're coming at it from the enforcement side, as well as different sort of plaintiffs' litigations and that sort of thing. So on the US, there's a lot happening from a lot of different directions. I think the EU, and I'm not a EU regulatory lawyer, so I don't want to get too much into detail, but as I mentioned, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations have quite specific requirements for climate-related disclosures, and comes with the green taxonomy. I think there's expectation that there will also be more regulation from the EU on the S issues, as well, with a sort of corresponding social taxonomy to come with it. And then, of course, in my earlier remarks, I touched on, some of the national, the European state laws and regulations that touch on sort of modern slavery, human rights. There is also going to be coming out of the EU, a mandatory human rights due diligence set of regulations that very squarely fit within the S space. That has, I think, been postponed again. It's maybe the second or third postponement, but now that's also expected coming up in the new year. I think on the Security Exchange Board of India, I don't really feel like with this audience I'm the right person to speak to the detail of that. But obviously, I think to me it's an indication of to pick up the sort of last part of the question on whether regulations are needed in order to achieve the ESG transformation that I think many of us here feel like is needed if we're to get this our economies onto a sustainable footing. My response would be that I don't know that regulation is necessarily needed, but in fact, it's something that I think businesses should want. Obviously, as we said earlier, more regulation and more law requires more compliance and more risk of non-compliance. But I think part of the challenge, I think, has been in the ESG space and getting the business community on the right side of these issues has been a lack of consensus in our societies about what the role is for business, what the goals should be. So, the more laws and regulations on the books means, sure, greater risk of discrepancy in reporting or public exposure of things that could enhance reputational risk and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, in a sort of more of a glass half full frame of mind, I think regulation hopefully reflects a settled view about what societies expect from business and how their activities impact human rights, the environment, good governance, et cetera. And this sort of benefit of increased legal certainty, I think will serve the business community very well. I think without regulation and law, I think we would be getting there. But to me, I think that as a push factor, as you mentioned, Dinesh, will certainly drive things forward more quickly and with more clarity. Sort of knowing what the rules of the road are, instead of sort of dealing with fuzzy sort of notions and expectations and desires of the business community as codified and sort of more sort of, again, as I said earlier, soft law sources. Having sort of clearly articulated rules governing business behavior will be a positive thing. So anyway, thank you again for the opportunity.
No, thank you, Ulysses, and again, very
Dinesh, just one suggestion that at this point in time, would you like to take a couple of questions from the audience?
Sure, I will. I think we can.
There's one question which says, are ESG factors a part of lending decision by the banks?
So I think maybe, Akhil, this could be a question for you. That and this question is from Surya, that are ESG factors a part of lending decision by the banks? Yes, banks are looking at it, but Akhil, it'll be great to get your thoughts on that.
So basically, as I said, there's no systematic approach to that today. Although if you see what SEBI has done is, earlier it was a business responsibility report, which we used to call BRR. Now it is named as BRSR, which is Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, which is voluntary this year. And from, I think, 22-23, it's now mandatory. But these are only for the top 1,000 market cap companies in India. So if the scores are available, and I think there are a host of kind of agencies which will rate you. But if the key lenders and investors, as I said, would do their own deep dive, when you do an analysis of any business or you do a diligence, you do a deep dive and try to understand yourself what are the ESG risk as well as the opportunities kind of. And as Shweta and Richa also said, these metrics can be very different for different kind of assets you may be lending to. Hence, I think I don't say there's a one approach to that from all lenders. Today, we see it's more of a customized approach, which lenders take and they try to deep dive into and check what are the risks and opportunities ESG bring beyond what is there in the financial statements, and that factor into the lending decisions.
Thank you. Over to Dinesh. Continue, please.
Thank you. I think maybe one more question from the audience which is there, and Shesha, you may want to throw some light, because I think we were discussing about what are the material factors. The question is, any specific thoughts pertaining to the logistics industries from an ESG perspective?
Sure. I think as we discussed, the industry itself has some specific challenges, right? The amount of emissions across the board. Logistics is one of those industries which has a very strong leg on the environment side. So for most of these industries, and for the larger ones, you'll already see the large players in the logistics space already have some very clear and ambitious targets out there in the market. So that could be a good guidance for how we think about it. But if I were to think about the E, S, and G legs of the industry, both in terms of their own internal climate footprint as well as the broader ecosystem, because the logistics industry is also a very ecosystem-driven industry. So on the environment side, how are you thinking about your climate footprint? How are you thinking about your waste management and your supply chain? Those could be three very specific areas that the industry needs to think about. There will be other aspects of water and ecology and so on, but these three could be the top three to think about. On the social element, obviously there is a broader community angle to this. But internally because logistics is again one of those industries which is very large in terms of the certain type of population that they hire, groom, develop. Again, how do you think about the elements of learning and development, skilling for the industry, and making sure your people agenda is strong will be another one for the industry to think about. And similarly on the governance side, many of these are common frameworks and standards, but having the right disclosures in place. And again, thinking about your policies, not just for yourself, but for your ecosystem of suppliers. How do you make sure the ecosystem is onboarded, whether it's around disclosures, around procurement policies, around security, privacy, and so on. So these are some of the key areas from the industry specific view. I think Akhil touched on the banking side. Very similar as the banks are thinking about lending. I think how the industry should also think about it is, as these banks are trying to give you finance, they are also assessing your ESG metrics. So positioning yourself right, and this is again the proactive part, becomes important, not just only as an annual exercise of a sustainability report, but this is going to change, fundamentally change how you run your business.
No, thank you. Thanks for that, Shesha. I'm going to take one more question because I'm seeing that, and I'm cognizant of the fact that we don't have too much time left. This is a question, and I open it to any of you from the panelists or who would like to take this on. And this is that, how does a rating agency validate the claims made in the report? Barring a few, most of the companies top 1000 do not disclose targets on their KPIs. They only report progress. How do you assess, is the company really making progress? It's a very interesting question. So who would like to take this? Richa?
So this is actually the big issue. And, when you talk about what companies need to do, the problem is not just targets. Actually, today, if you look at, most companies, barring again the top few hundred or scores of companies, If you're saying that I have an ESG strategy, to implement that strategy successfully, you've got to have an ambition, then you've got to have KPIs, and you've got to have targets. I think that is where the ball is falling a bit, which is that those aspects are not embedded into the business. So you may have a financial target and a bottom line target and a margin target, but do you have this embedded in the system? Is it embedded in the performance management system? And that's where HR, and if you really talk about it being a business intrinsic aspect, then you need to embed it into performance management systems, and then you will start having targets, and you'll start kind of tracking versus targets. In the best of companies in India who have BRSRs, you will not find performance versus targets. So that's an absolutely spot on observation. And I believe the 2-3 solutions to that are: one, this whole aspect of setting the ambition and setting the KPIs and track and reviewing them the way you would do a monthly review on financial performance, to make the ESG factors also a part of that same performance. The second is this wider awareness across the ecosystem of your suppliers, channel partners, other business partners, and that is not there. What is this animal called ESG? And I think the reason why companies don't do that is because it's not that they're hiding something from you, they've just not done it. And they are not able to do it because the amount of investment which is required on just R&D to get some of these solutions going is woefully low for even the best of, again, Indian companies. If you have to have green products, if you've got to have raw materials substituting current raw materials, you have to have R&D investments to understand and assess the impact what the new green raw materials will have on the final delivery of the product and whether consumers adopt it and adapt to it. And I think the R&D aspect is something which doesn't get spoken about, doesn't get addressed, doesn't get linked to ESG at all. And till some of these things happen, which is ambition, KPIs, investment in R&D, we'll continue to have this solution till the push comes from the regulator to say that it's got to be versus targets, and then probably we'll start having that too. So sorry, a long answer to the question and the observation, but yeah, we are a long way off from there.
No, it's a very valid point which you did make, because I guess it just boils down to the fact that today, we have so many fragmented voluntary standards to follow, and it has created, while there are some companies which are very high on the maturity curve, but when we look at the mid-sized ones, they're actually really confused as to where do they begin this journey, right? Because they don't know where to start, right? And I think that's what somewhere we need to be able to simplify that. I know that we've run out of time, but just one last question, and very relevant to the to all the directors who are prevalent in this question, is to you, Akhil. What is your advice on what Boardroom should prioritize in 1 year if they had to implement ESG?
You see, I'll try to keep it short in interest of time. Currently, what boards are doing is, in the ESG, they're looking at governance, possibly through an audit committee, through internal audits, and looking at top 10 risk. They're also looking at, as part of it, a little bit through a CSR committee, and also environment part, and I come from hydrocarbon business, so we have HSSE committees. So in parts they are doing it. But if I'll say fast forward now, what the board should start doing and focusing more on a more structured way, I can say that first, the board should ask the management to identify all the ESG stakeholders and their expectations. So that's the first thing which needs to be done. Then link the long-term business plan and possibly the objectives or purpose of the company to the ESG goals. What do you want to achieve as a company, as well as how does it interact with your ESG priorities and goals? Identify all the ESG risk and opportunities. Once this is all done, I think then try to convert that into relevant metrics. And because why I'm saying this is very specific to each company, while SEBI has certain mandates and possibly they'll come with certain sector related mandates, but individually boards can do that, come with the relevant metrics, KPIs, targets, and simply start monitoring them kind of. And why I'm saying this is because this few steps will allow the boards to kind of focus more in a structured way on the ESG parameters. It will be more what I can say defined by them and obviously monitored by them. And then some of the parameters can be very simple, the old ones which we have been using, like environment, waste management, employee welfare. We can look at inclusivity benefits, occupational hazards or health and safety, even customer protection or in B2C companies, or product integrity, what product you're producing, CSR, and any details of cases filed against you, what litigations you are getting into. So I think it can be a host of parameters. I can go on and on. There can be hundreds of them, but finally the board can go look at, identify all these, what is the right matrix, KPIs, targets for the specific company you are director or independent director on, discuss with the management, MDs and CEOs, and start monitoring them kind of.
Thank you, Akhil. I think what's apparent is that IOD needs to organize a separate session just on what the boards do to prioritize ESG. But with that, I want to just say thank you very much to Ulysses, Akhil, and Disha.
Dinesh, as an MC, I exercise his prerogative of asking one question.
Of course.
Right, thank you.
Please go ahead.
Anybody can answer. We have heard that a lot of investors are sector agnostic. Will that tribe now vanish? And people are going to actually look at ESG as something which will drive and move them away from being sector agnostic.
But I can take a jab at it and then I can open it to the panel. But at least, considering I work very closely with the private equity community, what I'm seeing really is that no, I think your investors, the investors who are sector agnostic will continue to be sector agnostic, except that when they're evaluating companies, the ESG criteria, which is already there, is only going to become more prominent. That's the trend which I am seeing. But happy to have the views of any of my fellow panel colleagues.
And then just to add, maybe a lot of funds do come with very sector-specific mandates, right? It's just not that every fund or every investor will come as a sector-agnostic theme, kind of. So there are a lot of green themes which are coming, and we are seeing, and a lot of data, I think there have been presentations, more and more money is being attracted by businesses which are more green and more ESG compliant, I'll say that.
Yes.
So with that, Mr. Prasanna, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you once again to my colleagues in the panel. Thank you really for sparing time and being out here.
I request Mr. R.G. Rajan, board member of National Governing Council and honorary director of Institute of Directors and the former chairman of RCF, to please extend a vote of thanks to the moderator, the panelists, and to all others concerned. Over to you, Mr. Rajan.
Good afternoon. We had an excellent webinar on ESG, the new frontier of governance. And we had close to around 250 participants in this webinar. And it's a very interactive webinar as I could see it. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Nareed Godrej for his excellent keynote address. His poem on ESG was simply superb. It was an out-of-the-box address. He made the point that good ESG will give good multiples. Also, the board will have to be fully involved in the ESG evaluation. The two easiest things to start on ESG are energy efficiency and waste elimination, which will go a long way in promoting the environmental part of it. Mr. Swaroop Monti also had a very brilliant address, and he made the point that ESG integrates the 3 Ps, people, planet, and profit. He also mentioned that ESG creates multiple positive impact on the companies. ESG is gaining momentum in India, and he mentioned that, Mr. Mohanty mentioned that the ESG analysts analyze around 150 non-financial parameters. Thus, ESG goes beyond financial reporting and is going to develop in a big way in the coming future. I also thank the moderator, Mr. Dinesh Anand, and the panelists, Mr. Ulysses Smith, Mr. Akhil Mehrotra, Ms. Richa Arora, and Ms. Shreyasha George for an excellent panel discussion. And good questions were put up to them, and they made a very good clarifications on the various points asked by the questioners. I thank the sponsor, NLC India Limited, a Navratna company of the Government of India. I also thank our knowledge partner, Grant Thornton, Bharat, and I thank our academic partner, Alliance University. I thank Mr. Arun Balakrishnan for his opening address, Mr. Prasanna for doing a very good job of the coordination and the moderation and asking questions, and Mr. Jay Sundareshan, as usual, asking tough questions to all the speakers. I also thank the participants, and I thank Team IOD Bangalore for organizing this wonderful webinar. And thank you very much. And again, we'll have one more of the series in the next coming year. Thank you very much, and Happy New Year to all of you in advance.
Thank you. Thank you.